Greetings. I'm Amanda Brantner, Senior Associate Director of Online Programs at Geese College of Business at the University of Illinois. We look forward to spending the next hour with each of you during this webinar. In this time of social distancing, I'm joining today from my home, while our presenters, Professors Werhane and Luckman, are practicing social distancing from our campus studio. Before we get started, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items related to the Q&A portion of today's session. Please submit all of your questions for Professors Werhane and Luckman via the Zoom Q&A feature. Your questions will be submitted publicly for the whole audience to see. To develop consensus around questions, participants should use upvoting. The upvote thumb is located next to the question in the Q&A window. You can only vote once, and you can reverse your votes. Popular questions will be addressed following the presentation. General housekeeping questions will be answered in text by the Geese team working in the background. Questions submitted via the chat will not be taken. With that, please welcome our moderator, Elizabeth Luckman, Clinical Assistant Professor of Business Administration and R.C. Evans Data Analytics Fellow.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for joining us here today. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this conversation. I look forward to your questions. In my own work, I'm interested in how we can make the most out of our experience at work, how we can become more effective and more ethical problem solvers, leaders, and team members. And of course, the current state of the world presents a unique challenge and one I believe we can navigate and emerge from stronger as long as we reflect on, think critically about, and learn from what is going on right now. And that is part of the reason we are here today. So I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Patricia Werhane. She is an adjunct professor here at the University of Illinois, the Ruffin Professor Emerita from the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia, the Wicklander Chair Emerita at DePaul University, founder and former editor-in-chief of Business Ethics Quarterly, and a founding member and past president of the Society for Business Ethics. Her most recent book, Alleviating Poverty Through Profitable Partnerships, is available on Amazon, and she's the co-producer of a documentary video series addressing issues related to social justice and global poverty called Big Questions. Professor Werhane is going to share information today about thinking critically about the ethical challenges we're facing in global business. And at the end of this, we'll set aside some time to have Patricia Werhane answer your questions. So please continue to post those and upvote those. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to Professor Werhane.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I look forward to our conversation, and I look forward to your questions. I may not be able to answer them all, but I will certainly try, and some of you will probably answer each other. In this terrible time, we see the rapid spread of the coronavirus. We've created opportunities as well as challenges, both locally and globally, as we quarantine ourselves locally while still dependent on global imports and supply chains for goods and services. For those of you from Illinois, we have just imported 1 million masks from China. That shows how dependent we are. So in this webinar, I want to talk about basically one issue. How do we balance public health with the pandemic and social isolation with financial health, where massive unemployment will be economically disastrous? Now, is that an either-or question, or is there a middle path? And that will be what I will discuss today. So I want to talk about, first of all, two contrasting viewpoints. In this viewpoint, you see that someone has drawn the circle for the debt to be larger than the pandemic. I think that's a controversial graphic, and we can come back to that later. But let me quote from Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick. He says, and this is a quote, I didn't make it up, Americans should go back to work even if that causes the deaths of their grandparents who would willingly sacrifice their lives for the sake of economic growth. Well, as a grandparent, I'm not so sure about that. The opposite point of view, which you've heard many, many times, is Governor Cuomo from New York, who says, given the choice between economic prosperity and the preservation of human life, every life is worth saving at whatever cost to the economy. So those are really the two sides I want us to consider, and then we will see how we come out on those two. I want to begin first with a little background perspective, and that is we all identify locally. I am from Chicago. My sympathies and sentiments are here. I think about the people in my community who become ill, and I also identify, frankly, with where I was born. I was born in a small town in Idaho called Twin Falls, Idaho. Idaho is a big, but almost no population state in the western part of the United States. And whenever people ask me where I'm from, although I left when I was 18, I say, I'm from Idaho. But at the same time, we have this enormous global interdependence and connectivity on goods and services. For example, you're all on your cell phone or laptop or tablet when you're listening to the webinar and watching it. Those phenomena are made from approximately, I don't know how many countries in the world. Dell Computer claims it makes its computers from parts from 22 countries. Now, if you want to, you can pull apart your cell phone. I don't recommend doing this, by the way. I tried this, and you can see where the parts are from, and they're not marked, unfortunately. But when you get home tonight, look at your clothes. I am wearing a suit from Korea. My blouse is from Vietnam. My shoes are from Italy. What's underneath is from Bangladesh. I don't have one single solitary piece of clothing that was made here in the United States. I try to shop in local markets, but it turns out, although the food is grown locally, the flowers are imported from Ecuador. Look at the ventilators and the other health care equipment. Again, they're made from parts all over the world. And back to now the famous town of Twin Falls, Idaho. It has the largest Greek yogurt factory. Chobani is all made in Twin Falls, Idaho, the largest Greek yogurt factory in the world. Well, who would have imagined, right? So we have this global interdependence for almost everything we have. And so there are obviously responsibilities and obligations as well. So how do we approach this issue? How do we approach global health versus financial health? Or is it a vice versa, or do they come together? I'm going to back us up and talk about approaching it from a moral point of view. So I'm going to take three ethical perspectives, and Elizabeth is going to introduce us to a fourth. She said I should have considered. First of all, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as you know, that was formed in 1948 by the instigation of Eleanor Roosevelt. It mirrors somewhat our basic Bill of Rights, but adds a lot more meat to those. Then I'm going to talk about justice or fairness in context. And then I'm going to talk about a cost-benefit perspective, which many of you have heard a number of times in the news. So first of all, the universal basic rights. Notice these are the United Nations argues that these are equal rights. Everyone has them, and everyone has them equally. And when you join the United Nations as a country, you sign up for those, although of course not every country remembers that they've signed up. So we have issues here. But the basic rights are obvious: rights to life, survival, liberty to speak, freedom of movement, rights to work or not, rights to worship or not, and enjoy due process, of course. Now, as a person with rights, I also have obligations to respect and protect the equal rights of other people, or at least not create harms. What's interesting, I think, because we're talking about commerce, is that in 2015, the UN adopted the guiding principles on business and human rights, sometimes called the Ruggie principles, because John Ruggie, created these. And this is just in brief. The document says the role of business is to respect, protect, and remedy violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So businesses organizations have obligations and have to respect these rights. And that's important in this pandemic when you think of the number of people who've been laid off or furloughed and whether or not their rights are being respected or not. So that's the first piece. The second piece of ethics that we're going to talk about is fairness. The idea is, how do you treat every person as an equal? You don't treat people as equals. Think about the pandemic now. I don't give a ventilator to everyone who comes in the hospital. In fact, I don't have, but suppose I had enough ventilators. I still don't do it because some of those people don't need them. So what I do is I give the sickest people, because I'm trying to raise them up to equal to actually to live, obviously. So in healthcare delivery, because we're short of things, as you've heard many times, we usually triage. So the sickest and the ones who are most likely to survive are first in line, if you like. And those of us who are very, very sick and are probably not going to survive will be sort of down the line a bit. But what's interesting in commerce, we have a principle, at least, of equal opportunity to hire and retain and promote the most able. So in commerce, we don't hire the sickest or the weakest. That would be, you would think that would be really weird. We don't do that. So we have this opposite kind of view of fairness in commerce. And then the question is, do we have a right to work? The UN says we do, or is it a right to be equally considered for a job, which in the United States, we usually think of about working in that way. The third part of the ethics I want to talk about is about utilitarianism or cost benefit analysis. Now notice both commerce and triage in healthcare are based on this principle, the aim of which is to provide, increase, or improve economic or physical well-being. So the philosophers call that utilitarianism. That's sort of philosophical jargon, but it really means that the goal of any principle, any action is to maximize interests, maximize benefits, or maximize happiness, or minimally reduce harms or sufferings, and in our case, illness. So I'm going to take us on a thought experiment, and you might not like this, and I hope you don't, because I didn't like talking about it. But I think it's interesting to think about. Suppose I did a cost-benefit analysis, and if I find that economic well-being outweighs health. And so it's fine if we go back to work, even though more people are going to be ill and more people are going to be dying, because that will increase our economic well-being more than just social isolation and quarantine. Now, I think you're not going to like that. Many of us are sort of government or Governor Cuomo addicts. I think he's probably right. And a utilitarian, interestingly enough, won't like it either. Why? Because according to utilitarianism, human beings and their lives and their rights must always be brought into this equation as equal players. So we have to weigh the fact that we have human beings. When I do my cost benefit analysis, and my analysis that I just did is going to mean a lot more people are going to die than if we continue our quarantine and social isolation. So I'm going to suggest now that we have two moral imperatives here. The first is really obvious, based on the principles of human rights and the right to life and fairness and cost benefits. Our moral imperative is to reduce pandemic infections. And you all say, yes, okay, well, yes, so I know that, all right. But I'm going to suggest a second moral imperative, based again on the same principles, on principles of human rights, the right to work and the right to live decently, and to be fair to those who had jobs and don't now, that the second principle is to continue and encourage global commerce. Now, the first one I think is obvious, but the second one you should be asking, why the second moral imperative? And why is it moral, for heaven's sakes? And I'm going to argue it is an imperative for at least three reasons, and I suspect some of you will come up with some more. First of all, without work, the unemployed will suffer terribly and survive only with difficulty. And we all know that. We've seen our neighbors and our friends and our family and people we don't know who are suffering so much from unemployment, who are trying to get by, who are trying to find food, some of them trying to find shelter. It's just an awful thing. Secondly, with massive unemployment, consumers won't have any purchasing power, so we don't buy anything, right? The stores are closed. And if you've probably read that many of the big box stores are going bankrupt because they don't have anybody in there buying things because, of course, they don't have any money. So without consumers, of course, what happens to global commerce? It shrinks. So now I don't have any imported food. By the way, I forgot to mention that, but the United States imports 20% of all its food. So now we have no imported food. I have no imported clothes. So I'll find something else to put on, but it's going to be iffy. And of course, I don't have any flowers, and no new electronics or no parts for the older ones. Now, if some of you I know have been to Cuba, and you've seen how they patch up old cars. They take a 50 Chevrolet and it's still going. It's still going because they make their own parts, because Chevrolet doesn't make parts for a 1952 Chevrolet anymore, of course. And if it did, Cuba doesn't import because they have almost no imports from foreigners like us. And you see very bad internet service and often cell phones that are really, really antique if you have one at all, and most people don't. So that's the kind of life we would have to live. And I don't think most of you are going to like this. And in fact, you're not going to have a webinar, frankly. And so it's not only an economic downturn and a threat to workers, but it's a threat to communication. How will we then communicate, as we do globally, as you know, all the time? And then third, and I think this is the most important issue, we need global commerce. Why? To provide the necessities to address the pandemic. Hospital beds, masks, gowns, ventilators, respirators, new medicines, they all come globally. They're not all made here in the United States. We don't have, in fact, I don't know if we're able to do that without importing parts and materials from other places. I mean, I think we've forgotten how. So I just don't know what would happen without global commerce. I think we both there would be an economic downturn, but I think there would be also, again, a loss of lives to the pandemic. So, sorry, I went the wrong way. So the question still is, are we willing to sacrifice lives to protect global commerce and reduce unemployment and suffering? Or are we agreeing with Governor Cuomo that we have to put all our financial resources into global health, or there'll be an extraordinary loss of life? And if employees are going back to work too soon, which, as you know, is the argument now in the media, the chances of increased infections is exponential, according to the experts. So it looks like we're sort of in a Groundhog Day here. We're back to the question I started. And is this an either or? And let me just stop and say for a minute, when I was asked to do this webinar a month or so ago, I got as far as this argument, and then I got stuck. I was stuck with the either or. I didn't quite know where to go from there. And then fortunately, I came upon a Nobel Prize economist at New York University. His name is Paul Romer. I recommend you look him up because he has created what now I think is going to be adopted in this country, but we'll have to see. He said, since we're spending all this trillions of dollars, he said, let's spend 100 billion now on test kits and protective gear. Really gear up those productions. And according to something I read today, we should gear up to have at least test 10 million people a week. We now test 150,000 a day. This is the whole United States. So that, and then by September, we should have enough testing for 30 million a week. And you know, then it would only be 12 or so days. I'll let you do the math, but everyone is tested. So you want to test everybody, and then we want to provide protection for those who are exposed to others. And this is a quote from him. So at offices, manufacturing plants, service organizations, even restaurants, where every employee, manager, and customer would be tested. And with testing and protective gear, he claims commerce could continue at the rate it did before the outbreak. Now that is a little, I think, optimistic, but I think it's an interesting challenge. And we're seeing now a lot of pressure on testing and test kits. And we're also improving the test kits too, which is a good thing. And I just read that Volkswagen, Germany, is going to start manufacturing cars again in one of its factories, adopting these same principles. Everyone will be tested. Every employee takes their temperature before they come to work. If you have a temperature, so you stay home. They wear their protective gear to work. They don't change it there. And they work 6 feet apart. And if they're any closer, they wear masks. And then after each shift, the place is scrubbed clean. And so there's a space, there's probably an hour between shifts, which, as you know, if you've ever worked shift work, people tend to leave and come overlap, no overlapping at all. And then they start again. Now, this is an interesting experiment. It's expensive. It will cost them more per auto than they have now. But it seems to me it's worth a try to try something like that. And let me, by the way, say we can do it. We have the capability to create that many test kits and protective gear if we put all our efforts into that. And of course we have, they're going to develop test gear kits that I can take home and test myself. Well, we hope I don't lie, but so that will be very interesting to see how that works out. And so Romer's proposal, which I came upon actually last week, seems to me in the media at the moment, and not everyone is talking about it, although Professor Romer doesn't always get the credit here that he should. So it seems to me that my putting my either or was wrong. It was really wrong, that the pandemic and the financial health overlap. They're interdependent on each other. The financial health is important to deal with the pandemic, and the pandemic is the instigation of thinking about how we can do this and how we can do it better. So some takeaways from this dialogue, and something to learn, I think, about ourselves, that when you're stuck in an either or dilemma, think about challenging yourself. Think about stepping back for just a few minutes and try to take a more disengaged perspective. Now, it's really hard. It's really hard if some of your relatives have the virus, or some of your relatives are in nursing homes and you can't go see them, and we all have those relatives. But if we can just step back for a minute out of our, or if I'm unemployed, of course I'm thinking about my job and my family, and we're all mired in that, and that's our sort of local perspective, and that's okay, that's good. But if you can just step back for a minute and think, maybe there's a third way. And I think that Romer's middle path responds to both of those perspectives, and it's viable and it's doable, and we can do it. We don't need to sacrifice lives, and we don't need to succumb to a financial disaster. But I would conclude, ignoring one dimension of this crisis, either global health or global commerce, we may fail on both counts. Now, a second stepping back for a minute, that was going to be the end of what I had to say, but Elizabeth, who read my paper and looked at my PowerPoint, she said, no, you can't stop there, she said. You have to talk about what does it mean to you? How can each of us do something? And because I've talked about big global issues, but each of us can do something. So I'm going to just throw out a few ideas, and you'll have some more, I'm sure. First of all, I've argued that the physical and financial health can work together. And these are policy issues, as you know. They require national decision-making and state decision-making, and even international cooperation. And these policies affect us, but how can each of us contribute to their success? And I have a few suggestions. First, stay at home, wash your hands. My hands are just turned into shriveling. Wear gloves, wear masks. When I came down to Champaign from Chicago, I was wearing masks and gloves, and I think that's very important. But secondly, keep in touch with those who live alone or in quarantine. If you can, Zoom. If you can't, it's all right. Call them. There's still telephones, Call people who are alone. Call people who are in nursing homes and can't see anybody and can't get out and have to eat in their rooms. Call them, see how they're doing. It's amazing. I called some young woman who, well, not so young now, woman who I'd gone to high school with. And it was just wonderful. I haven't seen her in, I don't know, hundreds of years. It was just great. Touch base with everyone. And then if you can, I'm not very good at this, make masks. I learned to make a mask by taking a piece of cloth and folding it like this, and then putting those ponytail ties, and you put them in each end, and then you go like this, and you don't have to have a sewing machine. I can do that. Volunteer at the food banks. They're desperate for people. Be a teaching assistant for online classes. Look at your local community. It needs you. But I don't know in what ways, but you can find out. And then finally, maybe this is the most important thing, email your Congress people, email their governor, email the president, for heaven's sakes, and urge massive pushes for masks, universal testing, and ventilators. And finally, be safe.
Thank you, Professor Werhane. There's so much embedded in that conversation. And what we would like to do now, I have been monitoring some of the questions that are coming through. And in order to give us a chance to cover as many as possible, I'm consolidating some of these, but we're going to turn it back over to Professor Werhane to reflect on some of these issues. So one of the themes that I'm seeing come up is about sort of the global interdependencies that you talked about. And so what are the responsibilities of countries, maybe like the United States, who have a stronger economic background to support the countries that maybe don't have the financial means to import all the appropriate testing kits? And how do we think about our dependencies on other countries during a time like this?
Yes, we tend to think we tend to raise this good question, by the way. I'm not sure I can answer it completely, but we tend to see ourselves as a strong country, which we are, but we forget that we have obligations to other countries because we depend on those countries actually, we depend on them for customers, but we also depend on them for parts and services and all sorts of things. And we don't even think about how dependent we are. I was just thinking now of coffee, which I was drinking, that the coffee comes from all over the world, as you know. I don't think we grow any coffee in the United States. I may be wrong. Half of our cotton is grown in Vietnam, for example. I mean, we're just so dependent on just little stuff I don't even think about. And not to mention the big things like cell phones and ventilators. So we have this interdependence, and I think that means we have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to those in our supply chain. For example, are they being ethical? How are they treating their employees? Are they being fair? Child labor obviously is a huge issue, but are they also helping their employees with social distancing and with getting into hospitals? Are they helping their local communities with ventilators themselves? As you know, many countries in the world have such poor health facilities. And what is our obligation to them? They've been customers of ours. They provided us with food. What about the flower markets in Ecuador that I talked about earlier? What about those people? They work in very close quarters. They have a real problem social distancing because people live in such tight quarters. What are our obligations to those people who've been our clients, our customers, and our providers of many of the things that we are so dependent on we don't even think about? Coffee certainly is one we depended on, and tea. A lot of the tea is grown in India, and if you've been to India, you know all the circumstances, both positive and negative, and their social isolation project, which they have now, is very difficult in fact to carry out because people live in such tight quarters. So I think we have obligations all around the world.
I think what you highlight there, a couple of things that are interesting. One is issues around ethical dilemmas. We really want and seek concrete answers,
Yes.
But actually concrete answers isn't the best thing. It's raising the questions like you just did. So maybe there isn't a specific answer to exactly to whom we have an obligation, but rather asking the question and making sure it's on the forefront of our mind when we're doing anything is really important. You also touched on this, and I think, at the heart of every ethical dilemma is this self versus other interest. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how to balance that, how to find that middle way for self versus other, both right now as we're sort of figuring out things, and then how you might think that looks in the future for business.
Yes. That's, by the way, one of the things that philosophers have spent several thousand years debating on. So I'll try to be shorter than that. But it's all right, ethically all right, to be interested in yourself and to care about yourself, as well as care about others. Some of us think my ethical obligation is only to others, but that's not true. I have ethical obligations to myself as well. And I do that because we all are living with each other. And if I'm not looking after my health, my neighbors are going to suffer. My healthcare provider is going to suffer because I'm going to be expensive. So there are all sorts of reasons why we have obligations to ourselves as well as to others. And that's not wrong. That's good. And that's why social isolation, why you think, oh my gosh, this is terrible. It isn't terrible because you are really helping other people by isolating yourself. And I think we have to remember that. So we balance those back and forth. And it's very difficult. And there's not a simple, I do myself in the morning from 8 to 9, and then work about my family from 10 to 11. But we do it all as a piece. And sometimes we pay more attention to ourselves. And then sometimes we're just plain selfish. I know that. But sometimes we pay a lot of attention to others, and then we sort of deteriorate. Our health deteriorates, or our minds deteriorate. So we have to try to create a balance. I don't have a recipe for that. I wish I did. I know I go back and forth myself, and I'm sure you all do. But it's something to think about, and something to remember, that it's all right to take care of yourself. And the same thing as companies. Companies have to take care of themselves, but first, of course. But the first thing they think about is when they're getting goods and services and parts from other places, then that's part of the company. That's not just the isolation. I mean, you can't just isolate, for example, Apple, because Apple's computers are made in China. So they have obligations to those workers and to the supply chain that provides the parts for the Apple computers. And that's thinking about the others, even though it's part of my company. So I think we have to think of it that way as well.
It's the proverbial airplane mask metaphor. Put your own on before you put your kids on, or your other people,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So I want to take that answer and then add that to sort of the next level, which has come up here as well. And that is, you talked about the obligations for companies to take care of themselves and their own people. What are the ethical obligations of leaders? What do you think they will look like post-pandemic?
Oh my. I know.
Well, I didn't say the questions were easy. They got good ones on here. I didn't say they were easy.
I wish I knew that. I'm hoping that companies, and even small companies and medium-sized companies will realize how important their employees are. I'm not suggesting we pay outrageous salaries, but I'm suggesting that we respect our employees and give them equal rights and help them speak up and think about their health care and think about their well-being and find them places where they can feel at work and identify with their work. There was something in the paper yesterday about a fellow who works for Lysol. Lysol, makes a disinfectant. And he just works for Lysol. He's been there for years and years, and he just thought it was a job, and he got paid pretty well, but it was, just making disinfectant. Who the hell cares, right? However, when he got home, one of his children said, "You are a hero." He thought, "Oh, lovely, fine. I'm glad to be a hero for my children." But they said, "No, you're a hero because you're making Lysol. You're making a disinfectant, and that's saving lives." So he began to think that his little job, which he thought was of no importance, is really important. And if we can make people feel really important about the smallest jobs, I always worry about the orderlies, the people who clean up in hospitals. How can we they're critical, right? If they don't clean well, if you're in the hospital, that's not good. And the way is to make them feel good. And I think almost every job has got some feel good aspects. The other piece I get excited about this, there was a fellow whose job, he's worked for 28 years collecting garbage. That's what he does. He's a garbage collector. You've seen those people. I don't know if you ever speak to them. But they pick up your garbage every week, sometimes twice a week. He loves his job. He said, "I'm really doing something important. I'm helping people clean up and get rid of stuff, and that will help prevent disease." I just thought that was wonderful. Someone at his work has made him feel really important about something we all desperately need, and many of us don't want to do it. I don't know if you've ever done that. It's a nasty job, but he thinks of it as his job, and he's important. And I think if we can make people feel important about what they do, and think about that way, that we can really improve our workplace without having to do very much else. Now, are we going to do that? Well, I hope so. I hope because every company has obligations to their employees, but sometimes they forget, and sometimes they treat them as numbers. Sometimes they don't pay enough attention to the importance of what every single job has in our whole enterprise. And little companies, those are really important, because 80% of all commerce in the world and in the United States is done by small and medium-sized companies, not by the big corporations we hear about. And we don't want to forget about them. And their new bill has passed to help them out. But that's really important because those are what drive much of our economy. And if they can treat their employees well, and some of them usually do, then I think you can see how this can all, I would say, multiply and be really important. How will this look after the global pandemic? I don't know. Will we go back to our old ways? I don't know. The environmentalists think that it'll help us be much more aware of our environment because, as you know, the air is cleaner because we don't have so many cars running around, in fact, almost no cars and airplanes. Will we go back and clean up, or will we just go back to our old ways? I don't know. The optimist in me thinks we will try to do something new, but sometimes I'm a little cynical. So we'll have to see. I can't predict.
So going off of that, one of the tensions that read a lot about right now is this tension between how much government intervention versus individual freedoms should be balanced during the pandemic. So what role does the government play in telling people what to do to socially isolate versus should people have the freedom to go and do their jobs or whatever? So how should we, what's a way to think about that right now? And both for right now going through the pandemic, but also after the fact.
Yes. Temptation is on both sides. Then temptation is to say, you will stay home, you will not go out, you will do this, you will do that. That's the temptation that our national government has, and our states have, and our mayors have, and they can't help it because they're trying to protect us. On the other side, for those of us who kind of like to choose what we do, and we want to go to the beach, right? We want to go to restaurants, we want to go out, we're tired of home, we want to walk. In Chicago, we cannot walk along the beach anymore because too many people were there, and so everybody's mad at the mayor for that. But I think that's that either or again. So I think that by a middle path is wear your mask, wear gloves, test yourself, take your temperature, test yourself. And if we all do that, then we can all go out. And so that's sort of the requirement, if you see, I say the mandate is to protect yourselves and wear your masks and be tested. But then we can go and be much more independent. And so I don't think that's so bad. I mean, nobody, for example, we all wear clothes. Why do we wear clothes? I mean, that's sort of silly. And if you're in a hot, well, we're not in a hot climate. If you're in a hot climate, why do you wear clothes? Well, it's just nicer. And if you wear a mask, why? Because you're protecting yourself against other people, and they're protecting themselves against you. So it's in some sense it's a mandate, but in some sense a mandate so that we can act more freely and go back to our beaches and back to our restaurants and back to just walking around.
So do you think that the current sort of the economic model that we have right now will be, in the Western world in particular, will be viable post-pandemic? Do you think it'll change at all?
You mean the economic model of free enterprise?
Yeah.
Some people argue that it will because of all the mandates we've had. I don't know. I think so. I think a version of it will persist. Different versions of it persist pretty much around the world, and it works pretty well. As Winston Churchill said, capitalism is the worst form of economics except all the others. So I think we don't have a better model right at the moment, and it does allow us to do what we'd like to do, and most of us, some of us not, of course. There are always downsides, unemployment being, of course, a huge downside. But I think we will go back to that because we don't have any other model. We've tried other models around the world, and they don't work very well. So I think it has led, as you probably know, since the Industrial Revolution, we've had this exponential economic growth in the countries that are industrialized. In the countries that are not industrialized, they just sort of plug along and don't do very well. But that exponential economic growth due to the Industrial Revolution has made a huge difference in the lives of those people who live in industrialized nations. And most of us are fortunate that we do so. But in the countries that are not industrialized, we have to then work on what we're going to do about those.
So I want to go back to your answer about what ethical leadership will look like. And you talked about how important it will be for leaders to acknowledge all the different types of work that's being done and how valuable it is. Certainly this pandemic has brought to light the importance of jobs that maybe were not given the due that they deserved, because our essential employees, people who are working in hospitals, who are cleaning hospitals and making sure they're clean, people who are working in grocery stores. What you talked about was leaders should be helping them find purpose in their work. And I love that answer. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on how you think leaders can help people find purpose, both now and in a post-COVID world.
Well, I would go back a bit. You may not like this, but I would take out the word leader, because we think of leaders in this hierarchical sense. We can't help it because we've been brought up this way. The leaders are here, and then the next level, and the next level, and the next level. So we think of this often as a pyramid. I think that form of thinking is wrong. I think if you work from the middle, there's a lot of new literature on this now, thinking of leadership as being in the middle. So think of yourself as a leader in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a hospital, in the middle of a shop, in the middle of, say, the Volkswagen factory. And think about, then what is your influence? How can you do that? How can you be a leader in the middle? And then how can you appreciate all the people who around you and encourage them? I think that's what I would say is a model of leadership that works, frankly, better and helps everyone, including your company, by the way. It's extraordinarily effective in a company that has this sort of flattened hierarchy, and can be extraordinary. I mean, Apple was really started that way. Well, we had Steve Jobs as the innovator, but he had all these people who were just working and thought of themselves as doing something really, really important. And so he had very few chiefs. And it was, well, we know how successful it's been. So it is a model that we have to really think about carefully. And I think it's the model for the future.
I completely agree with that. And I love that it sort of, it really acknowledges that organizations are complex systems living inside another complex system, and these small disturbances can make a really big difference.
And also, if you ask people, just your ordinary people, what they're doing and how they're doing it, turns out they have some really good ideas. We forget. They have some wonderful ideas. That's what I, as a professor, learn from my students. I learn so much. I learn so much every time I teach from them, because they have ideas I hadn't thought about.
So this builds on that. This is actually one of the most upvoted questions for today, and that is, what type of skills trainings do you think will become most important in a post-COVID world?
Oh my goodness, I don't, I don't know, but I think that's very difficult, because we're still undertrained and underskilled in this country. And as you know, the president has recently, or just yesterday, said he's not going to give any green cards, and the green cards are usually to scientists and physicians and people in research. And in the Wall Street Journal today came out and said, that's a terrible idea. Now, the Wall Street Journal doesn't always criticize our president, but they're absolutely vehement, because they said our economy depends on these skills and we don't have them all. Now, maybe by having no more green cards, we will think more carefully about how we train, how we run our schools. And that would be fabulous if we train all enough people. But so far we haven't. And so far that's a detriment. And so I don't know. And we still need, says I'm from a farming state, Idaho, we still need workers to pick our crops. We still need, and that, by the way, we're still getting to import temporary workers, because none of us wants to do that. People say, well, those are jobs, but nobody will do it. No one will do those jobs, and it's too bad. I don't know if you ever really want to work hard, go out and try to pick something all day. Pick blueberries. It's easier because you don't have to lean down so much. Pick blueberries all day, and then tell me how a wonderful time you had. This is work. Try to pick strawberries. You have to be way down in the ground. I mean, this is all hard. So we have to figure out, we still need those people, and we need many more skilled people. We don't have enough scientists. We don't have enough people doing research. And so that's up to our focus. And for those locally, we can all focus. It's another thing we can do. I just thought of that. We can all help our schools be better. We can help our local schools be better, and that will make a huge difference post-pandemic, because then we will have training people with skills who can do the kinds of things in this technological age that some people have been left behind in. Yes.
You know, I do think there are, our institution is one of them that is rethinking how do we educate people, how do we engage in skill training, and how do we offer specific skills as opposed to an entire degree for people who want small bits and pieces for a particular job that they're doing. And I definitely think that we're going to see more of that. I read an article earlier today that was arguing that even though we're all socially distanced, that one of the most important skills we can focus on is human interaction and how to solve problems. And so whether it's how to have a conflict over Zoom, right? Or how to navigate, how to whistle blow when you're not in the organization and seeing things, or you're seeing things from a different perspective, how to talk to people about really difficult issues. I think this is a little self-serving since I teach leadership and ethics and that's where my research is, but I think teaching people and having the skills to interact more effectively is going to be something that's important as we go forward.
And maybe, this is being optimistic, but maybe in social distancing, we are developing those skills, because I have to communicate to people I'll never see.
Mm-hmm.
I might see their faces, but a lot of them I don't. So I have to learn to communicate, and with never interacting personally, physically with them. And I think that maybe we're to be able to develop those better skills in this isolation, even though we may not like it as much. Of course, we like to be around people, real people. I think it's an opportunity to develop those kinds of skills. Good.
Transformation is always painful, and that's what we're in the middle
Yes.
of, is transformation. Okay, so here's a big question for you, and this is one that I know as a business ethics professor you've likely been asked before, but how do we think about business ethics? Is ethics really the way we define ethics as sort of this, tension between self and other, or right and wrong? Is that even the right word? How do we define ethics and morality in business right now and going forward?
Good question. I've been asked several hundred times, but thank you. Well, in the first place, we see, business over here, economics over here, and ethics over here. And we think of, well, I'm a really personally ethical person, but when I go to work, I just kind of follow what's going on. I follow the leader. But that's wrong, because business is intrinsically doing with morality for the very, very simple reason it affects people. If you don't have employees, if you don't have shareholders, if you don't have customers, if you don't have suppliers, you don't have business, right? And those are all people run. So you can't avoid ethics. You just can't, because even if I say I'm not going to pay any attention to my employees, okay, that's unethical. I'm not going to pay any attention to thinking about ethics, that's all right. That's an ethical point of view, because whatever you're doing in commerce, from the littlest, tiniest business to the biggest business, you're affecting people. You have to. That's what commerce is about. So I just don't understand the separation of ethics from business. I think it's part of everything. I'm completely biased, and I always start my course by saying that, because otherwise I have students say, well, that's unethical, but in business it's different. No, it isn't different. It's unethical in business too, and it affects people negatively, just as it can affect people positively. So my mindset will not let me separate those two.
I think that's part of the middle way.
Might be part of the middle
Part
way.
of your
Good.
middle way. So I'm curious to know, how has your approach to your own work, whether it's writing or teaching, changed at all during this time? And do you think it'll affect how you interact with your students or how you research or write after this?
Perhaps it's reminding myself that I'm teaching a big course now at the University of Illinois. There are about 200 students. And that's a lot of people to think about. But if you remember, each one of them is a person, and each one of them has an agenda, and each one of them comes from a certain culture, a certain background, maybe a certain religion or not religion. You have to remember each one of them is important. And I think in this social distancing, where I don't see all of them, or don't see all of them at once, I think that's just a reminder of how important that is. And the second thing that, of course, I've been worrying about a long time and trying to figure out how can we do much more globally. I mean, global commerce is, some sense, easy to understand, but global poverty, how can we do more to alleviate poverty globally, and what sorts of economic instruments, because we're economists in business schools, what sort of economic instruments can we bring to bear on people in bad, terrible circumstances? I've been working a lot in Bangladesh with micro-lending, which has been extraordinarily successful. It has some negatives, I know, and I know the negatives, but it's been extraordinarily successful in pulling out, it's probably 10 million families out of abject poverty, where you don't even have one meal a day. Think of that. So but there are other ways to do this. And there's a fellow at the University of Illinois then who works with people who've had a microloan and then trains them how to do marketing, and marketplace literacy, he calls that. Well, all of those things, I mean, we can do more of that. We can raise the economic bar just with our skills that we have. And I think the more I think of it, I think we need to try to encourage our students to think about those kinds of things as well. I have to tell you one story. I used to teach at the University of University of Virginia, and we have big classrooms, and everybody is assigned a seat, and you have to sit by someone all the time. So this fellow he's American, named Chip. Well, anyone named Chip is American. And he sat next to a fellow named, I think his name was Madhu. He was Indian. And Madhu said, you know, I come from a community where we don't have electricity. I learned to read without any electricity at all. And my community doesn't have any electricity. No one in my area, he's from Bihar. No one in my area has electricity, never had electricity. And this Chip, of course, being an American, said, well, that's impossible. Of course, you know how we are, as usual. And then he said, now, wait a minute, we've got to do something about this. So they got together with some students from Rochester Institute of Technology who were really good at technology. And in this village and in the villages around, they grow rice. And they have rice husks, and rice husks pile up because animals won't eat them, people won't eat them, and they just rot. So he invented something called a gasifier. And you put the rice husks in, you burn them, and you can provide electricity for 2 villages. And so I thought, aha. And they have created a company now, and they make money, and it's you know, so there are things that people can do. And these were just students. They weren't anything, you know, we just think, oh, just students. They weren't just students, of course, at all. So there are all kinds of things that we can do at any age, and these are little things, but it made a huge difference. And the company has expanded now through that whole area, and it's a huge difference if you can see at night and read at night with electricity. I mean, that's amazing.
I love that story because I think we're living in a time right now where the sort of barriers to entry for that
Yes.
kind of project, and for people, for students, for to come together, for people to come together globally and solve problems, even in small ways that can ramp up, the opportunity is greater than it's ever been. And so I think that that's a great call to action for everyone to think about what we can each contribute.
Yes.
So I have a couple of specific questions here that I wanted to ask you. That as we wrap up, we've got about 7 minutes left. So from Manal, do you think countries like the USA, where there's a low number of manufacturing units, are dependent on other countries, should deglobalize to some extent?
I've heard that argument, but I don't know if we can. I don't know if we know how, and I don't know if it's worth it. I don't see any reason to. I mean, I think it's better to recognize my interdependency, because we flourish more with that interdependency, frankly. Just purely, you know, think about flourishing. We flourish better when we do what we do best, and then another company makes a part that I can't possibly make, and I import that. I mean, I think deglobalization, I don't think we'll do it. I think it's not viable, but I think it's, in some sense, it will lead to global downturn. And I think it's unethical, because you're also denying companies from other places that do something really well, like my old Ecuador flowers. Mm-hmm. I can't grow flowers, and they do it really well. Well, I would love to, I don't want to put them out of business, just being selfish. Not to mention, I want them to have jobs. So no, I think deglobalization would be a real mistake.
Flourishing is not linear. we don't flourish linearly upward all the time either. So just
No.
because there are downturns and sometimes people sacrifice, and it doesn't mean that the whole system is. And so that's another systems perspective answer. As a moral question, if the wealthy countries import medical equipment and food from poor countries and drive up the prices, are we just shifting the pain?
Yes, but we don't have to drive up the prices either. We don't have to drive up those prices. In fact, often, I think the million masks that the state of Illinois has imported from China, those are going to be cheap, cheaper than my little handmade ones. So I think we don't necessarily drive up the prices. We don't have to, and we probably shouldn't. We have to be careful with that.
So I'm going to shift away from the global perspective and ask another one that's a little closer to home, and that is, what are the ethical implications of isolation? So you talked about how one of the things we all can do is reach out to somebody we haven't talked to in a long time, but what sort of do you think downstream ethical implications will we have from this shift to being alone all the time?
I think we'll find it interesting and maybe more difficult to communicate in person with people, frankly. We go back to Zoom people instead of talking to them personally, and I'm not sure that's a good thing. And then going back to work, it will be interesting to see how I interact with my colleagues in person and how we can work together, because we have to work together usually. And that will be very interesting. And maybe, I hope not, we get used to social isolation, but I hope we don't. At least I find it extraordinarily boring.
I don't think you're alone there.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we wrap up, you and I were talking a little bit before this started about this idea of the middle path and
Yes.
Romer's sort of economic perspective on the middle path. And this is a prominent theory throughout philosophies throughout the world.
Yes.
You can talk about Taoism, you can talk about Aristotle and the Golden Mean, but if you look at the trend, there's some idea that moderation is the goal, right? Not being too excessive on one side or the other. So will this middle path, will it work? Can we make it work?
Oh, I think it's very workable. Yes. Oh, absolutely. I'm convinced, the more I think of it, and I've thought about it a lot, it's absolutely workable. Now, will we always do middle paths? This country is not so good at middle paths. We'd love to do things in excess, which is all right. It's very exciting. But I think this kind of middle path will get us back into business and still help prevent more deaths. So yes, and it's not, for some people, they won't see it as middle. They'll see it as, oh, well, yes, of course. And that's all right. It doesn't have to be. Maybe if you see it, maybe if you talk about it as a middle, people think, oh, well, sort of muddling along. But it isn't. It's very audacious. So it's middle, but middle audacious. So no, I don't think, no, absolutely not. This will work.
Middle audacious.
Middle audacious.
Can't end on anything really better than that. Professor Werhane, thank you so much for your insight and your thoughtfulness today, and for answering our questions. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda to wrap up our session.
And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Werhane, for sharing your insights, and Professor Lechman for serving as our moderator today. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with both of you virtually, and also with our participants, who we want to thank for joining us. We hope you've gained some valuable knowledge, and we hope you all stay safe and healthy as we weather this time. Our best to all of you. Bye-bye.